It is not easy to introduce Jean-Michel Rabaté, our first keynote speaker for today. Professor Rabaté is a world-leading scholar in the fields of modernism and critical theory. He has consistently investigated the link, what I would like to call the confusion of tongues between modernism and critical theory, and between modernism and theory, and his work is a reference point for anyone researching this intersection, including the person standing in front of you. We are very pleased to have him here, and we thank him for accepting our invitation. Jean-Michel Rabaté is one of those critics, theorists, thinkers of literature that one thinks with. So in lieu of a list of titles, allow me to highlight some concerns that stand out in his writing, in his reflection. His vision of modernism emphasizes the interpenetration of theory and text as a dominant feature of the field from its very constitution since the end of World War II. He has shown that the visible affinities of theoreticians for modernist texts, for example, Derrida and Joyce, Adorno and Beckett, Hélène Cixous and Clarice Lispector, Paul de Man and William Butler Yeats, just to mention a few, but there are many others, this affinity turns modernist literature into a site for interrogating and reframing our critical practice in literary studies more broadly. Building on the insights of Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes, Mikhail Bakhtin, among others, Jean-Michel Rabaté has argued all along that the interconnection between literature and theory has not lost its appeal, urgency, and productivity. This is no small matter to us, for us, gathered here in this location, in this institution, Foscari, the Department of Linguistics and Comparative Cultural Studies, where gracious director, gracious vice director, gentle students, gentle colleagues, the urgency, appeal, and productivity are testified by the institution of the first course in theory only last year. Concerns with questions of tradition, influence, heritage, and memory mark his production. Clearly, his work is about much more than can be described here. His output comprises multiple books on Joyce, studies of Samuel Beckett at the limit of the human, studies of the future on the future of theory and the aspects of the modern. His work also engages in important ways psychoanalysis. He's the author of the Cambridge Introduction to Literature and Psychoanalysis and the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Lacan. He has introduced thinkers who have inspired this conference, for example, Jean-Luc Nancy. And like a couple of other participants at this conference, he has contributed to the Cambridge Companion to the Body in Literature. Jean-Michel's research is guided by the same motivation that he has detected in Beckett's study of Proust, and that is promoting curiosity and renewal. I'm therefore delighted and honored to turn the floor to Professor Rabaté for a talk on the age of modernism, modernism between obsolescence and juvenescence. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much, Mena, for this wonderful introduction. And I want to say, first of all, that I'm very honored to open this conference. And I thank again Mena Mitrano and Simone Francescato for the excellent organization. And it's for me always a pleasure to be in Venice, a city I've come to regularly since I started working part of my dissertation on Ezra Pound. And so one had to be somehow a regular visitor of Venice. My title, of course, plays a little bit on this word in English, which is age. In French, we say vieillesse or âge, we're not the same. And I'll just say that I'd worked recently on the question of obsolescence, but in a very particular context in psychoanalysis. That's one of the recent books I've published. So I'll begin with two little stories. First, a vignette from Dijon. That was my first job in France before I moved to the United States in 1991. And after I'd moved, I didn't return to Dijon for a long time until one of my good friends and colleagues died in 2010. So I was invited for the homage, and then I presented a book I just published, 1913, The Cradle of Modernism, which has something to do with my obsession with like historicizing modernism. I came to a new place, a new cultural center that had been built, and I was greeted by countless people I didn't know at all. All told me with absolute eagerness, "How young you look." So at first I felt flattered. For a 60-year-old man, this sounded really neat. After a while, I realized that something was wrong. They all used exactly the same exclamation. Then I looked at the poster. The poster, instead of presenting my book, 1913, had put it as my birth year. I was born in 1913. All those people thought I was almost 100-year-old. That weird experience of sudden aging immersed me in the Proustian idea of the bal de tête, to which I'll return. Second vignette from recent moment in New York. Adam Phillips was launching his book called The Life You Want. One chapter, Psychoanalysis for Beginners, quotes a book whose title amuses him, Aging for Beginners. Phillips writes, aging is always and can only be for beginners. Even though we tend to refer to it as something for the old, we have always been doing it right from the beginning of our lives. And this is indeed something that struck me. Thanks to him, I read this book from 1981, a compendium of practical advice written by Mary Stott, a British journalist who died at the age of 95. Stott had been the editor of the women's page in The Guardian, and one interesting idea that I got from her book is that she rejected the literary approach to old age. She, for instance, attacks Shakespeare's well-known Jacques speech in As You Like It, evoking old age as a second childhood. I quote, a second childhood, mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. She refuses the images of traditional images, and a no-nonsense attitude illustrates how today, and I took a rapid look at the literature, abundant literature on gerontology, often leery of the dramatization that literature provides about old age. She objects to that. She objects to this idea that old age would be a condition. It's not a disease, she writes. We are people, not a problem, not a separate species. I will talk about this slightly differently when I engage with Kafka's country doctor. How can we avoid treating older people as other people, as Christine Brooke-Rose insisted, and I'll return briefly to Christine Brooke-Rose in conclusion. Insisting on pragmatic advice, Stott explains how to navigate care systems, health insurance networks, support system. She's very frank in a discussion of sexuality, arguing then that when partners are unavailable, there is no shame in masturbation. Moving away from literary cliches, she wants to decondition old age. How can literary approaches give new questions? How can they contribute to getting, as Philip says, the life you want? He said that each time he gave his book, he would say to people, I give you the life you want. I learned something about this issue from my past collaboration in New York with the artists Arakawa and Ginz. Arakawa and Ginz tackled the issue of immortality from the angle of what they call the architectural body. A wonderful book, I recommend it. The thesis is strong. Architecture is made for bodies. They call these bodies organisms that person. The goal of architecture is to reverse mortal destiny. In 1997, they launched the slogan, "We have decided not to die." That was part of the Reversible Destiny project, which was then at the Guggenheim, and I worked with them. They were lovely. We had fantastic discussion in a loft in Soho. And then it took me some time before I realized that, in fact, it was Arakawa who had the idea, "We have decided not to die," and he was quoting a famous Japanese novel, Soseki Natsume's 1905, I Am a Cat, that I discovered teaching a class on animals. At some point in this novel, it's the poet, the owner of the cat, who declares, "I've decided not to die." He's a hypochondriac, but he refuses to buy a life insurance. He swears he'll never die. They say, "I've made a vow never, never to die." At the end of the novel, surprisingly, it is the cat who dies. He falls into a jar after getting drunk, murdered, possibly. We know it was the only way Soseki Natsume found to finish his novel as enormous, one of Japan's best-known, most loved narratives, and the introduction of modernism, modernist literature in Japan, 1905. So Arakawa's insight came from literature. Originally a disciple of Marcel Duchamp, he came to New York to meet Duchamp. Arakawa inherited the skewed logic of the French conceptual artist. He and his wife Madeleine worked on how to change our perception of aging, death, and the body. But if cats have 9 lives, we have only one. Sushaku Arakawa died in 2010, Madeleine Ginz in 2014. An undialectical and perhaps illegal death, their last project was to get as many signatures as possible to make officially death illegal. It was enough to refute the utopia. Is the unavoidable coming of old age the story of beginners who can only learn to survive when it's too late? This is a question with which I would say modernism begins, if we agree that the first modernist writer is Jonathan Swift. Not just because of the Battle of the Books, whose fight between the ancients and the moderns heralds Derrida's concept of a haunted archive, but also because he was the first to debunk the myth of immortality by appealing to the aging body. You probably know this passage, famous passage, third book of Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver discovers the Struldbrugs, immortal human beings, and is delighted. Finally, there are people not subjected to death. Gulliver assumed they must be happy and wise. And of course, this is met by derision by the Lugnagians, who know that the fate of the Struldbrugs is not inviolable. By the age of 80, they are legally dead, I quote. As soon as they have completed the term 80 years, they are looked upon as dead in law. Their heirs immediately succeed to their estates, only small pittance is reserved for their support. At 90, they lose their teeth and hair. They have at that age no distinction of taste, eat and drink whatever they can get without relish and appetite. It goes on for a long page that is absolutely grueling. Since he has seen the physical degradation of perpetual senility, let's say old age without health and youth, Gulliver concludes that the sight of these creatures made him change his mind about immortality. After such a vision, I quote, "My keen appetite for perpetuity of life was much abated." As Robert Fitzgerald has shown, Swift's satire debunks the arrogance of the French Académie Française, founded in 1635 to keep the purity of French language. Its 4 members, where one of my friends is one now, are still called the Immortals. In 1712, Swift imitated the Académie Française with a proposal to correct and improve the English language. It was rejected. By 1725, seeing the absurdity of the task, he turned his own idea in derision while making fun of French pretension. So from the start, I would say, the literary and cultural fields gathered under the heading of modernism have been founded on an unstable alliance between the young and the old. Old age is less a condition than a negotiation between mortality and immortality. As Nietzsche wrote, one can die from immortality. One has, I quote, to pay dearly for immortality. One has to die several times when one is alive. This problematic has been examined by Martin Hägglund, who is now at Yale, in a 2012 discussion of high modernism. In the earlier book by Hägglund, which is an interesting radical atheism, Derrida in the Time of Life, he rejected the idea that there was a turn to religion in Derrida. And then he deployed Derrida's concept of survival to read modernism systematically in Dying for Time, a book in which he studies Proust, Woolf, and Nabokov, all read from the angle of survival. For Hägglund, any desire for immortality is an illusion, and he is, I would say, Gulliver's heir here, that must be shattered. The logic of survival is predicated on finitude and on différance, Derrida's concept with an A. Difference always wins. Difference always dismantles striving for eternity. I quote one sentence that he repeats very often. The survival of a mortal being is quite different from the immortality of an eternal being. He plunges us into the ineluctable modality of temporality and begins with Plato. In the Symposium, we know that Diotima holds that our desire to survive is driven by wish to be immortal. Hägglund queries this. Quote, the desire to perpetuate a temporal being is incompatible with the desire to be immortal. Immortality would not allow anything to live on time, end quote. One might object that Socrates and the other participants in the banquet believe in gods as immortal beings. Can one accept that temporal finitude provides the only theoretical framework for the Greek gods? What if there were gods, not gods in whom we believe, but gods who reconcile the fiction of eternal life with the enjoyment of time-bound objects? I do not personally believe in Greek gods, but I believe that Hägglund's argument leads to oversimplification. Heidegger was more cautious, arguing that radical finitude defines the human condition. I would say that we need a whole new phenomenology that combines literary analysis and an analysis of the desire for immortality, which is a sort of opening to the future. For instance, another point made by Lung quite strongly, when then he moves from Plato to Freud, who often quotes the Symposium, is to reject the idea of the death drive. The death drive for him is a contradiction in terms. And even if, according to Freud, there is a question of the timelessness of the unconscious, for Hagelund, it is only survival that gives us a certain key. Playing for time. And and then from the symposium, I'll talk a little bit about Strauss. For Leo Strauss, who has a really interesting book called On Plato's Symposium, one cannot understand the symposium, here I'm summing up a long argument, without taking into account the gods, Greek theology. He insists upon the fact that the symposium is set in 1416 BC, at the time of the scandal called by Alcibiades, accused of the profanation of the gods, just before the Sicilian expedition that saw his downfall. For Strauss, we only understand the symposium if we know that Socrates had been accused of impiety. He was accused not only of corrupting the Athenian youths, but of sacrilege facing the gods. The dialogue's climax, for him, Diotima's speech, which is not Lacan's reading, but we can return to that, is a conception of eternal love. However, for Strauss, this rests upon a complex knot connecting the gods, sexuality, immortality, and the city. To make sense for Strauss of the architecture of Platonician concept, we must include desire and eros. Eros is a god. We should not forget this. The immortality of the gods is foundational for politics. Lacan takes a very similar position in his confrontation with Plato. Of course, he doesn't say exactly that, but for him, the gods lead to what he calls the real, a sort of end point of language. Lacan also invents his own myth of the lamella. The lamella is something that is libido, and libido is connected for Lacan with language. Language's purpose is to teach us the meaning of death. As he writes, the letter kills, but we learn this from the letter itself. This is why every drive is virtually a death drive. See, for Lacan, on the contrary, the theory of the drives in Freud has to be seen as fundamentally the death drive. Acquiring language means being taught by death, a death conveyed unconsciously when we struggle to learn words. But there is always a limit, which is the real. One needs a sort of mythology to construct an architecture of the drives. Taking into account the architecture of the drives, we need to go beyond Hagelund's binary of chronolibido and chronophilia. This is where I would find something in Proust. A survey of the theme of aging in Proust illustrates what I criticize in Hagelund's thesis, who has, of course, a chapter on Proust. It would be too long to go back to the entire chapter, but like Hagelund, I will discuss this extraordinary passage at the end of the Recherche, which is what Proust called the bal de tête. Okay, strange term, but you have it in French. It is a moment when the narrator has been sick, there's been the First World War, he's been away from Paris, and he returns to Paris, and he goes to the Guermantes, and it's a day party, and then he cannot recognize anybody, and he has the impression that they all have put on a disguise, s'être fait une tête, slightly dated French expression. So everybody looks like they've been disguised into something else. A draft of La Recherche underlines fait une tête as an excellent phrase, formule excellente. Indeed, all revolves around the conceit that age turns everybody into characters in a fancy dress ball. He called this a fête travestie, un bal costumé. And bal de tête in French meant a party in which people only disguise their faces. The first sign of the disguise comes from hair. white hair, snowy beard, silver whiskers, milky mustache attached to the faces. Quote, his mustache were white too, as though the hoarfrost of hop my thumb lay still upon them. They seemed to get in the way of mouth, which had difficulty in moving. One felt that having made this effect, they ought to have taken this beard off. Then the narrator's gaze falls upon a former enemy, Monsieur d'Argencourt. The depiction is cruel, I quote. Not only had he concealed his real beard, which was hardly pepper and salt in color, beneath a fantastic bushy growth of improbable whiteness, but he had turned into a contemptible old beggar man, and a diplomat whose solemn demeanor and stark rigidity were still present to my memory, acted his part of old dotard, with such verisimilitude that his limbs were all of a tremble, and the features of what had once been haughty countenance were permanently relaxed in an expression of smiling idiocy. All the characters seemed to be acting in a vaudeville. Quote, I was tempted to laugh aloud at the sight of this sublime old gaffer, as senile in his amiable caricature of himself as he was, in a more tragic vein, Monsieur de Charluc, thunderstruck into humble politeness. They all looked like characters in a farce by Regnard, rewritten in an exaggerated fashion by Labille. This is also true of the women. Madame d'Arpajon looked like a character in a pantomime, condemned to appear first as a young girl, then as a stout matron, with the final appearance as a quavering, bent old crone. So we then move on to this idea that time is a sort of artist, and a number of arts are called upon, painting, sculpture. Indeed, old age makes people lose flexibility. They are stony, petrified, ruined statues. But the narrator discovers that he has also aged. Everybody calls him my old friend. The process of unconscious degradation is universal. Old age has made time, a word always capitalized in those pages, visible. It is a medieval allegory that has been embodied. The problem is that the concept of time was the theme of the novel the narrator planned to write. I quote, I had made the discovery of the destructive action of time at the very moment when I conceived the ambition to make visible, to intellectualize in a work of art. So what Proust rehearses in these hilarious and ferocious 60 pages is that when time is embodied, when its very substance appears, the writer's task becomes desperate. Images of play acting and sculpture are relayed by painting, and he understands that time is an artist who has made all the sitters unrecognizable, an artist who works slowly. And they also, the distance between present sight and memories, of course, is because he remembers how they would look before, even when they embellish a little bit, like Odette, the famous Odette, whose metamorphosis is minimal. Nevertheless, even then, a face becomes curiously like a strange bar of nougat, in which the narrator distinguishes, quote, traces here and there of verdigris, a small pink patch of fragmentary shell work, a little growth of an undefinable character, smaller than a mistletoe berry, less transparent than a glass bead. Such a close-up on the face is really Swiftian. Most critics are shocked by the ferocity of Proust's vision. My friend André Bernheim from Princeton called this long section the catastrophe of the face, an apocalypse combining personal evolution and social transformation. Even when Odette seems to escape from the ruin of time, the description remains vicious. I quote, Madame de Forcheville, that's she, as though she had been injected with some liquid, some sort of paraffin with the property of inflating the skin but protecting it from change might have been an old-fashioned cocotte, stuffed for the benefit of posterity. We are in 1920, but she seemed to come from the exhibition of 1878. And then we know that even that second flowering will not last. Coup de grâce is this. Less than 3 years later, I saw her at an evening party, not quite in her dotage, but showing signs of senility, grown incapable of concealing between a mask of immobility what she was thinking, or rather, quote, parenthesis, for thinking is too elevated a term, what she was passively experiencing, nodding her head, compressing her lips. Why such brutality? Proust enhances time destruction and the destruction of all the values. That's the Nietzschean aspect of Proust. Nothing remains, not even accurate memories of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, the genealogies of which he was so obsessed. But at the same time, the narrator understands that because time is an artist, he must learn to imitate time, to reproduce something, and continue with the notion of the bal travesti. And this is where, and that would take too long, we would move on with this idea that we would have something like the cross-dressing. It's something that Elizabeth Leidenson, in her excellent book on Pound's lesbianism, has well discussed. To sum up my analysis here, I'll distinguish three possible attitudes facing that section of Time Regained. The first position is the usual reading that admits that Proust believed that time could be abolished. Eternity would be reached thanks to involuntary memory. Then time is annulled. The experience of such resurrections, as he called them, is the principle of the entire text. This is the Platonician Proust. Even Gilles Deleuze endorses this view in Proust and Science. The second position is that of Hagelund. Complete refutation. For Hagelund, there's always time-bound finitude marked by a pathetic mixture of chronolibido, chronophobia. One cannot escape from time. Even to comprehend it, eternity remains a delusion. The third position, which would be mine, would be Heraclitean. The discovery of aging as a universal process brings about the realization that time and eternity are not incompatible. Time destroys, but it destroys like an artist who erases in order to recreate, even if it is to give birth to grotesque features. The stark vision of destructive time functions like a recall, the trumpet of judgment. It's high time to write. There is a duty to write, which puts Proust on an axis linking Kant and Beckett, the urgency to write. Time generates insight that are intellectual and embodied. We are here closer to the real meaning of involuntary memory, closer to forgetting, as Walter Benjamin noted, and closer to the Freudian unconscious. Thanks to that process of involuntary memory, we discover truth written in us by life. Truth combining mathos and pathos. A similar passage through thanatophilia, aiming at rejuvenation, appears in the archetypal poem of modernism, The Wasteland. Its Greco-Latin epigraph introduces the Sibyl, borrowed from Petronius' Satyricon. The Sibyl repeats, apotanai telo, I want to die, in Greek. We may remember, if we remember Satyricon, that this comes from the told tale told by the unreliable narrator Trimalchio, who is probably inventing it all. There is hope that in the Laughter and Parodies we have something, a return to the old myth. And we can say that this is something that we have in high modernism, as defined not only by the mythical method of Eliot, but also in what Pound was doing. And this is where I have this idea of Pound talking about the idea of make it new, as he found in a Chinese chronicle. We also know that Eliot was playing with the idea of becoming old. The last play of Eliot, The Elder Statesman, stages this idea of old age somehow. And something that I have done elsewhere, I will not have time now, comparing Beckett's Endgame with The Elder Statesman, both somehow going back to Swift's pessimistic view. However, here, if I mention Beckett, it is just to say, and you're kind enough to mention Adorno, Beckett's reading by Adorno is crucial here, because what he says is that in Endgame, the problem is not to die, but not to die. The question not to be able to die. Endgame is a chess problem in which all is lost, but we have to play on the game until the end. And there is no certainty that the end can end. It is more the abortion of death, as Adorno puts it. Death could miscarry. Which sends me to another, so for Adorno, the key is Kafka to understand this. What does it mean that death could miscarry? For Adorno, the key text is Hunter Gracchus, a character of legend invented by Kafka, who dies, but somehow he misses his own death and he survives endlessly. I will here take a slightly different text, which is the parable of the country doctor, one of Kafka's most bizarre texts. Not sure whether, yeah. It is the title story of his published collection, Ein Land Arts, which means that Kafka really loved that text. He was so critical for his own production. And so it's one of the most mystifying texts. I have to say, it took me really a long time to like it and to understand it, if I ever understood it. And I owe this to my friend Mark Harman, who translated it recently and read it in public at the library in Philadelphia, and then I got it somehow. The plot seems simple. In the middle of a snowy winter, an old country doctor is summoned to examine a sick child in a distant village. But his horse has died. He is stymied and wonders how to get there, worrying with his maid Rose, a young woman. An unknown stable hand emerges from the pigsty, brings two horses ready to ride, but also bites the cheek of Rose, the doctor's maid, whom he lusts after. Rose flees inside the house, but the doors, we are told, will not resist the stable hand's furious assault. Eager to stay with Rose, the stable hand sends the doctor away. The doctor, tormented at the idea of Rose's imminent rape, reaches the village, and then he sees the boy, and because in his hurry, he concludes that the boy is healthy, although the boy says he wants to be left to die. However, the villagers want him to do more. They force the doctor to undress, to stay and sleep naked next to the boy. Then the doctor discovers that the boy has a hideous wound, an open gash teeming with worms. Concluded that he's done for, nothing can be done to cure him, the doctor escapes by jumping through the window without putting his clothes on. He rides naked on one horse, while his coat trails behind in the snow. And this time it goes very slowly. And this is the last monologue. Naked, exposed to the frost of this unfortunate age, with an earthly carriage, unearthly horses, I, an old man, drift about. My coat hangs on the carriage behind me, but I cannot reach it. Nobody among the able riffraff of my patients lifts a finger. Betrayed, betrayed. I've been deceived. And it ends with a very bizarre sentence. Once one has followed this misringing, Verläuten of the night bell, it can never be made good. Here we see that there is no cure, no resolution. The story refuses a cathartic release, as we have in other stories. What looks like a linear plot turns into a surreal nightmare. The statement of the boy, at first, "Doctor, let me die." But then he realizes that his identity is connected with the wound. This boy who says, "I came into the world with a beautiful wound. That was my soul endowment." The wound is then called a flower by the doctor. And there is a close-up on the wound that links it with the name of the maid left to fend for herself in her house. The nightmarish vision of the wound begins at the hip, I quote. And it begins with the same Rosa in German, rose pink, which is the name of the maid. This is the description of the wound, which is quite bizarre. Rose pink in many shades, dark in the depth, lightening towards the edges, delicately granular with blood pooling unevenly, wide open at the surface, like an above-ground mine, but only from a distance, close up. A further complication becomes apparent. Who can look at this without whistling softly? Worms, similar to my little finger in thickness and width, rose-colored and blood-splattered, held fast in the interior of the wound, wriggled toward the light with their small white heads and many little legs. Poor boy, you cannot be helped. I have found your great wound. You are perishing from the flower in your side. End quote. Kafka seemed to be rewriting Flaubert's story of Saint-Julien l'Hospitalier. Julien, the saint, has to sleep naked to leper, who reveals he's an angel, but here no miracle happens. It is the wound only that stands out as a sign of life. Will you save me? The boy whispered, sobbing, dazzled by the life of his wound. The festering wound, embellished with twisting worms, mirrors the doctor's sexuality. These worms, for all the revulsion they inspire, reach an intensity of description quite rare. And the color rose betrays the doctor's repressed desire for his maid, now lost to another. And so the old doctor and the young patient are consumed by the wound as the flower of desire. Henry Sussman, a friend of mine, has a long analysis, wonderful, in the text that was never a story, showing that the boy is the doctor's double. And that's why the villagers placed them side by side in the same bed. Rose is their symptom, a symptom linking death, disease, and sexuality. Or perhaps, to be more precise, the drives, the wayward horses, the stable hand who cannot be stopped, and desire subjected to repression. When he lies in the bed with the boy, the doctor thinks, I have to take care of Rose, and then the boy may be right, and I, too, shall want to die. So, traversing death is never negative for Kafka. It's only counterproductive if it prevents from taking responsibility. In the conclusion, the doctor understands that he's been deceived, and that he also realizes that he noticed Rose's sexual appeal only after another man made a pass at her. He discovers that if age is a disease, the disease cannot be cured, and then youth is a disease too. Better glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, as Keats wrote, and let the wounds proliferate. As in the famous In Front of the Law, a parable interpreted as a sign of universal lie, the only hope resides in an appeal to the pure, the true, and the immutable, which is the theme, if you know, of Kafka's Jurau aphorisms. This is also the theme of Eliot's Gerontion, when he writes this, in the Juvenescence of the year came Christ the tiger, in depraved May, dogwood and chestnut flowering Judas, to be eaten, to be divided, to be drunk, among whispers by Mr. Silvero, with caressing hands at Limoges, who walked all night in the next room. Or, as Eliot wrote in Journey of the Magi, I should be glad of another death. And this is where we are back to this question of make it new, but make it new when it is not just the old forms, but old age and death. This is the question that has been treated at my last example by Ettore Schmitz, Italo Svevo, who had known the premature end of a literary career and who was resurrected by Joyce. Svevo had written 2 novels, 1893, Una Vita, 1898, Senilità, that had aroused no interest. In 1907, he hired Joyce in Trieste to learn English, and then daily meetings reawakened Svevo's literary impulse. He completed Zeno's Conscience in 1923. International recognition followed. The continuity between all the novels has been well captured by P.N. Furbank. His obsession revolved around the idea of senility. I quote, if Svevo's novels are all studies in weakness, senility functions as a mobile concept that allows him to explore neurotic feeling of inadequacy, feeling inepto, or out of touch with his time. Senility is an infection of the will, a withdrawal from reality into daydreaming, an incapacity for taking decisions, combined with the illusion of doing so. In A Life, Alfonso, the protagonist, commits suicide at the end after being rejected by the woman he had before rejected. In Senilità, it's the protagonist's sister who dies after she realized that she is pining for the friend of the brother, the sculptor who seduces women, who pretends to be interested in her to humor her brother. Clearly, senility for Svevo does not mean exactly old age. When the novel was published in 1898, Svevo was 37. His hero is 35. We could return to this story. And one can say that what interested me here is what happens with the turning point of Zeno's Conscience. That is one of the first novels, one can say, in which the structure is a confession to a psychoanalyst. The novel begins when the psychoanalyst explains that he has asked Zeno Cosini to write what he remembers from his life, thinking that the writing will rejuvenate Zeno. I quote, "But he was an old man, and I hoped that recalling his past would rejuvenate him, and that the autobiography would serve as a prelude to his psychoanalysis." This is Dr. S. The psychoanalyst concludes that at the end, the writing cure has been successful, that he has been cured. Zeno disagrees. He rants against psychoanalysis, but he says it doesn't work. He writes this, "My therapy was supposedly finished because my sickness had been discovered. It was nothing but the one diagnosed in his day by the late Sophocles, for poor Oedipus had loved my mother, I would have liked to kill my father. An illustrious sickness whose ancestors dated back to the mythological era. And I'm not angry now, either, alone with my pen in hand. I laugh at it wholeheartedly. The best proof that I never had that sickness is supplied by the fact that I am not cured of it." I love that interesting double bind. The proof I was never sick is that I cannot be cured. This is Svevo's ambivalence facing Freud. Such a diagnosis might allow him to make sense of his father's last gesture in the confession. His father is lying on the deathbed. Zeno bends down to kiss him a last time, and then suddenly his father slaps him with all his might and falls dead. Does it help to know that there is something like the Oedipal structure? Maybe not. And this is where, okay, sorry. I will just maybe go a little faster. With Svevo's last play, Regeneration, a play that was almost completed when he died. It's a very strange extravaganza in 3 acts and 3 dream sequences, written when Svevo was indeed 66. His hero, Giovanni, is 76. He's an old Triestine Faust, tempted by modern Mephisto. His nephew, Guido, trained as a physician, who incites his uncle to undergo an operation that will cure him of his old age. It was not exactly the Steinach operation that Freud, we know, and Yates underwent, and they were quite happy, both of them, with the result. But it was a graft of testicle tissues from monkeys invented by Serge Voronov, a French surgeon of Russian origin. In 1920, he started grafting monkey testicles into the scrotum of his patients. Svevo had read Voronov's books. You can find them online, they are really interesting. Vivre, étude des moyens de relever l'énergie vitale et de prolonger la vie, 1920. Étude sur le vieillissement et le rajeunissement par greffe. Unhappily, I can tell you, it doesn't work. Anyway, it could only work for men, but it doesn't work. Anyway, the story is this. You have old Giovanni, who was retired, and his only pleasure is to have a daily walk with his grandson. But one day, this is when the play begins, he almost has a fatal accident. A car almost runs over the boy, and he comes back to the home thinking that his grandson has died, and everybody freaks out, one could say. And then he realizes he needs the operation, and he accepts. And then the second act, he's had the operation, and then he is turned into a sort of promiscuous and always randy old man who tries to have sex all the time with the young woman working in the house. And we understand that his older wife allows him to try and have some fun. And so we could say that we have a comedy at the end of remarriage, because he then can go back to his wife and understand the absurdity of trying to have sex with a 20-year-old and so on. We have a comedy of remarriage by way of testicular graft, I could say. Svevo didn't have time to be operated. He wanted to do it. He died too soon. Strangely enough, in a scene that is exactly announced at the end of the play, another car accident. In 1928, the chauffeur driving his car crashed into a tree. He was not severely wounded, but he died of a heart attack the next day. When he died, he had left another novel, interesting, in Italian, Il Vegliardo, a very old man, begun in the summer of 1928, and again going back to the question of old age, young age, and so on. Each time with this concept of rinverdire, this idea of being reborn and rejuvenated, making green again, rekindling, reawakening. Svevo's itinerary is a sort of senility dogging him at the age of 30, and then a hard-won youth regained at the age of 66. We know that at the same time, Svevo, even though he was critical of Freud, translated Freud's the 1901 Über den Traum, and uses dreams in the play very systematically. It would be too long to discuss, but I could try to prove that the dreams in the play are in fact rereadings and transformations of Freud's own dreams in the 1901 Über den Traum. Svevo had also a good knowledge of Georg Rodek's work, something that interests me a lot. And at the end, we see old Giovanni who wakes up and says, "A kiss, no," to his wife. "I love you. I never wanted to kill you. I love you, I say. In your name, I will feed mankind. This is the task of us old men, us old young men, us old young men." This oxymoron can stand as a conclusion. If I had one more hour, I would embark on a discussion of obsolescence in psychoanalysis, or I would read what I had originally planned to do, a section on Christine Brooke Rose, but I saw that two speakers are going to talk about, Christine Brooke-Rose. I'll just adapt the title of a last book as Plenary Lecture and of. I'll just conclude with a little biographical detail. Some readers of Life and Of may know that I am Jean-Yves in the story. Jean-Yves is a professor of English who lives in Philadelphia. He's the narrator's literary executor. And every time I go and visit Christine, she would ask me to kill her. And I would say, no, I am your literary executor, nothing more. I have a young daughter, but in the book she's called Rosetta. Why Rosetta? Because my daughter is trilingual, like the Rosetta Stone. Why am I Jean-Yves? I thought it alluded to the fact that my French daughter, my older daughter, is called Eve. When I said I had guessed the reason to Christine, who said, no, it's not that. She had looked up the etymology of Eve and learned that it derives from the Celtic if, the yew tree. And she said, you made me read that book. It was a nod to the fact that I had made her read the beautiful 1994 novel by my friend Dan Gunn, Almost You. She remembered that the title was Almost You, E-W-E, the female sheep. Being Jean-Yves, I was happy to have avoided the fate of the nasty O-P, those other people oblivious to the needs of crippled subjects who are unable to go beyond their blinkered projections. I was also relieved not to be counted among the OP as older people. In the end, I saw that I was, and still am, almost you. Thank you.